I don't like this. And I know that's very brave of me to say on God's green internet. We're talking heads on spikes kind of stuff. I was like kicking my little feet every single time they so much as looked at each other. Decrepit and decaying and gross. I would take a bullet for him. I was such a hater. Fully acknowledge some of the narrative problems with it. Fully don't care. If you had told me at the beginning when I started reading it that it was going to be my favorite book of the 2-month period, I would have laughed at you. And now I'm laughing at myself. If you saw my August TBR video, you might be expecting me to have 30 plus books in this wrap up, and I'm sorry to say that that is not the case. However, I did have a good enough reading month that I have not a top 3, but a top 5 books to share with you. Now, part of that is because we are covering July and August. If you're new to the channel, you might not know, first of all, that I am Sam. I'm a romance author based in the UK. And second of all, that because I am an author, I don't do negative reviews on this channel. So I'm not going to walk you through every single book that I read. I'm only going to tell you about the best ones. What I will do is I will put up on the screen now, right here, all of the books that I read or DNF'd during the months of July and August. I read 13 books and DNF'd 3. I'm not going to tell you which ones because that would count as a negative review, but you're welcome to leave some guesses in the comments. And eagle-eyed viewers might notice that one of those books looks pretty familiar, and that's because it's my book. And I did not just put my book on the screen because it came out in August, though it did, and if you haven't bought it yet, links are in the description as always. I actually read my book beginning to end this month. I listened to it on audio. I needed to do that for secret reasons that I'll tell you about in a future video. Subscribe if you're not already. But because I needed to consume the story, I decided to listen to the audiobook because I actually hadn't listened to the audiobook yet, not in its entirety. And so I decided to do that. And because it was a different format, I felt disconnected enough from it that I was able to actually just enjoy it as a listener. And I think that that was a really cool experience because I realized that I actually like my book, and that's a really difficult thing as an author to say because you just spend so long looking at it that you only see all the problems with it. And so for me to be able to say, I actually enjoyed my book, I wrote a romance book that I as a reader would enjoy, is very satisfying to me. What I did not do was put my own book in my top 5 books of the 2-month period because I felt like that would have been a bit too far. And normally in this video, I would do pre-orders, show you all the books that have come in over the last month, but actually all of those are going into my autumn TBR. I'm going to be doing a special autumn edition TBR video. It's going to be the next video after this one. So I'm going to save that conversation for that video. Instead, we're going to jump right in with my top 5 books from the last 2 months. And we'll start directly at number 5, which is a book called Fantasticland. This is a book unlike anything else that I have ever read. It's written as a tell-all, not so much a tell-all, but more as just a long-form piece of journalism about a disaster that has happened. It is fiction, but like that's the structure of it. And the disaster is that there's this theme park called Fantasticland, which is in Florida, and it rivals Disney and Universal Studios in terms of scale and popularity. And there was a hurricane, and hundreds of staff members got trapped in Fantasticland for weeks. They had plenty of food, plenty of water, stuff like that, but they very quickly devolved into absolute barbarism. We're talking heads on spikes kind of stuff. You know this from the very beginning. The book then interviews loads of different people to try to find out why that happened and why it happened so quickly. This is not an edge of your seat kind of book. There are a couple moments that are shocking. There are a couple moments that feel a little bit more gripping, but you know from the beginning what the end point is. So there's no twists and turns, so to speak. But the way that it's done is very, very impressive. I listened to the audiobook of this and I would absolutely recommend that you do the same. It's similar to if you've listened to Daisy Jones and the Six on audio or anything else that's set up like a podcast or a documentary. For example, I also this month listened to the audiobook for None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell, and part of it was like that. Same with the YA thriller Sadie that I listened to a couple of years ago now. And I love that sort of interview style when they have different actors for all the different interviewees and stuff like that. It feels so immersive. It feels like you're watching a documentary, but like about something fictional and therefore usually very exciting. And it was really interesting because while you knew the end point, and so a lot of what happened in the park wasn't that surprising, I really liked that a lot of it was also about the kind of celebrity and infamy that came after the fact. So this is written, I think, a couple years after the end of the disaster. And so people have been offered book deals and like gone on talk shows and stuff like that. Someone's in prison. All the trials have already happened. And so it's able to kind of examine that side of things to an extent as well. And while as an author, there were things that I was looking at going, oh, I would have done this, I would have done this differently. I felt like it was very true to form in the sense that everything that was there was like within the scope of what a long form piece of journalism would be had it been a real disaster that had happened. Book number 4, One for My Enemy by Olivie Blake. This is a Romeo and Juliet retelling about 2 magical families in New York City who are butting heads, to put it very, very lightly, over kind of infringements on turf and like scope of what they do for the magical community. These families have been feuding for years, but the patriarch of this family of boys and the matriarch of this family of girls, they're the ones that have been feuding. And it turns out that the children aren't necessarily on board with that feud. And like I said, it's a Romeo and Juliet retelling. Romeo and Juliet are Lev and Sasha, but there are other couplings that occur. And so it's basically about what does it look like for this young couple to meet and to fall in love with each other amidst this feud between families. The urban fantasy vibes are perfect. I loved Lev and Sasha. Lev in particular, I would take a bullet for him. But I also really love the angst and emotional depth of a lot of the other characters. This book gets a lot of criticism for something that happens around the midpoint. I'm obviously not going to tell you what that is, but it kind of obliterates the stakes of this book. What previously felt like life or death important doesn't feel like the stakes are that high anymore. And I think that's a really valid criticism, but I kind of don't care. The vibes in this book, like I said, were immaculate. Olivie Blake is such a poetic, beautiful writer. I know a lot of people didn't like the Atlas 6 because they said it was too pretentious. I loved the Atlas 6. This book was so good. I also listened to it on audio, and audiobooks are, let's be honest, they're usually a multitasking thing. I'm cleaning, or I'm cooking, or I'm walking, or I'm crocheting, or something while I'm doing it. I would just sit and stare at the wall, or stare at the sky, or stare out the window when I was listening to this audiobook. I was enraptured. Fully acknowledge some of the narrative problems with it. Fully don't care. As a side note, the matriarch of that family is called Baba Yaga, and I say that because in my 3rd place book, we also have a Baba Yaga, and that is When Among Crows by Veronica Roth. Yes, that Veronica Roth. And this is a very short book. It's almost more of a novella. It is, I think, long enough to be considered a novel, but it is very short. I think it was like 165 pages. Margins were massive, like very, very short. It took me a while to get through because it's a very dense story and it's based in Polish mythology and folklore, and so a lot of the terminology, I didn't know how to pronounce half the words. There's a lot of consonants in some of those words, and so for someone who doesn't speak Polish, for someone who's not a polyglot at all, I did find that quite challenging. But the story was stunning, and this book follows 2, eventually 3 characters from different magical backgrounds on a search to meet with Baba Yaga in order to get a favor from her. So one of them wants to destroy a knight of the Holy Order, so the people that hunt magical beings. Another one of them wants to have a curse lifted from her. The fact that Veronica Roth was able to make me care so much about these characters in such a short amount of time is nothing short of miraculous. Because you have all of this stuff unfolding, you have all of these magical creatures and beings that you need to explain, the description is fantastic, and yet she still makes time for like the character building. I don't know, it was just masterclass in doing a lot with very little. Do I wish there had been more of it? Yes, only because I really enjoyed it. But actually it was exactly the amount that it needed to be. It takes place in Chicago and it feels very urban as you're going through it, so another urban fantasy. This is really going to be a theme this month, actually. It was so immersive. It was so good. This was the last book that I finished in the month of August, and what a way to finish the month. It was so good. Number 2 on the list is The Invocations by Krystal Sutherland. And this is another urban fantasy, this time YA, and this follows 3 17-year-old girls, Emmer, Jude, and Zara. They don't know each other at the beginning of the book. Emmer writes invocations. She's a witch. Invocations are basically spells that a woman can basically tattoo over a pulse point, and they create a magical effect. So for example, the ability to slip from room to room, or slip into shadows, or the ability to always find what you're looking for, that sort of thing. Jude is a reclusive rich girl who tried to give herself an invocation and ended up tethering a demon to her that is feeding on her body and soul and basically making her decrepit and decaying and gross. This is the same author that wrote House of Hollow, which was like very visceral and gross. And so if you've read that, Jude is where a lot of that comes into play. And then we have Zara, whose older sister was murdered, and she wants to find a spell that can bring her sister back long enough for her to reconcile with her because they fought right before she died. And as these three are pursuing their own goals, it becomes clear that there is a serial killer who is murdering women who have Emmer's invocations on them, and that Zara's older sister was the first victim. And not just that, but this serial killer is stealing those invocations, which shouldn't be possible. So these three team up to hunt down this serial killer. The autumn spooky vibes are just perfect in this book. It is exactly what I needed to get me in the mood for spooky season. Really jumps you straight into that kind of atmospheric, creepy kind of feeling and just really delivers on that all the way through. Krystal Sutherland is so good at atmosphere. I loved these characters. There were a couple of moments throughout the story where I found myself thinking, that was a bit predictable, but it's YA, so that's okay that I, as an adult reader, found things a little bit predictable sometimes. I think I would recommend this book to almost anyone because it had the right vibes for people that really like horror and thriller, but it's not too scary that people that don't like that, me, are going to be like too creeped out by it. And it's not like high fantasy, so people that are intimidated by fantasy might be okay with it because it's more urban fantasy, so it's a bit more accessible, but does have a really rich kind of description of the relationship between people and magic and demons and stuff like that. So I think this book could be pretty much for anyone, which is always very to find, especially since I'm sat here recommending books to you. I recommend The Invocations by Krystal Sutherland, literally no matter who you are. And then finally at number 1, we have The Spellshop by Sarah Beth Durst. Now, I know I said I wasn't going to do negative reviews on this channel, but I have a confession for you. I did not get on with Legends and Lattes, and I know that's very brave of me to say on God's green internet, but it was not my favorite. And I thought it was a good book, but it wasn't for me because the stakes aren't just low, they are non-existent. Like, yes, there are stakes, but the success of the characters feels like such a given. It feels like a foregone conclusion to the point that you can't get invested in the highs and lows that get you to that conclusion. At least that's how I felt. And I know that other people love that and other people want that, and that's great. Fantastic. I'm so glad it exists for you. Not for me. So when I started reading The Spellshop, I was like, I'm not gonna like this book. I'm not gonna like this book. It's gonna be Legends and Lattes again. It is about a girl who was a librarian in the big city looking after all the spell books, but the rebels have set fire to the library, so she has absconded in a boat with a lot of the books and her talking spider plant, and they have gone to the magical island where she grew up, where there are mer horses and centaurs and stuff like that. And she decides, because the island is in trouble because the imperial sorcerers aren't visiting anymore to maintain the island's magic, she decides she's going to open up a jam shop so that she can sell spells on the side, because doing magic when you're not a sorcerer is illegal. I was like, I'm going to hate this book so much. And I honestly spent the first third of it like feeling grumpy and being like, I don't like this. Like, she's so cringy. She keeps talking about how awkward she is, and that's stupid. I was such a hater for the first like third of this book. And when I tell you that it not only won me over, but had me just completely under its spell by the end of it, I loved this book. The vibes were just perfect. The stakes were inherently higher than in something like Legends and Lattes, but like it didn't feel like a foregone conclusion that everything was going to work out, and not every single thing does work out. Like, there are gives and takes within the story, and I think that is what I was missing from something like Legends and Lattes. But I also think that throughout all of that, the cozy aspect of it is maintained enough that people for whom Legends and Lattes was the right balance, I think they will still like this. I loved the romance in this. It was so cute. I was like kicking my little feet every single time they so much as looked at each other. I could picture the island and the cottage and the cove like so perfectly. The description was fantastic, which I really struggle with sometimes in fantasy, because I feel like things are either over-described because they're fantastical, or they're under-described to try to leave it to the reader's imagination. And I feel like the exact right balance was found here, that it was immersive instead of overly descriptive. I just loved this book. Again, it's one that I think a lot of people would like. If you had told me at the beginning when I started reading it that it was going to be my favorite book of the 2-month period, I would have laughed at you. And now I'm laughing at myself, so that's fun. Anyway, those are my top 5 books of July and August 2024. Like I said, I've got my autumnal TBR coming up next, as well as some fun book news in the next few weeks. So make sure you subscribe if you're not already. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.